Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
So this is the 80s.
It was a free-for-all for concepts.
When your guard is down, that.
Very impressive gore.
I just think they're hilarious.
It's showtime.
80s horror was honest. Most horrifying things that I'd ever seen. Terrific.
It felt like a simpler time. Good and evil, right and wrong.
Hello and welcome to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast. I'm your host Matthew Perkovich and this is episode number 256. Available now for pre-order on Blu-ray and DVD, and also appearing as part of the 2019 Monster Fest that is currently touring across Australia is In Search of Darkness, the ultimate documentary on 1980s horror films that takes an uncompromising deep dive into the decade that pushed the horror genre into innovative, boundary-pushing heights and transformed the movie industry while doing so. Joining me now to talk about In Search of Darkness is the film's director, David Weiner. David, I thank you very much for joining me on the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast.
Pleasure to be with you, Matt. Thanks for having me on.
So, just reading up a bit about the making of this film and the origins of the movie is really interesting. Your film's producer, Robin Block, he was working on another similar documentary about action films, and that's when he came up with the idea about 80s horror movies. How did you get involved with the project and take on the reins of director of what really is a massive undertaking?
It is quite the undertaking, but we never necessarily understood how much of an undertaking it would be until we really got going. Robin was producing In Search of the Last Action Heroes, and he came up with that idea to take a nostalgia trip down memory lane of the entire decade of the 80s, because he realized that there are many films about, many documentaries about 80s horror films, but nothing that's a survey that focuses solely on that decade. There's wonderful histories of horror that are out there. There's wonderful movies that take anywhere between 4 and 6 hours to dive into the details of Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th. Those are wonderful documentaries. But this was an opportunity to really, take into account a lot of not only the really well-known films, but all the ones that are a little more arcane or eccentric or straight-to-video that exploded in that decade. So I came on due to a friend of mine who was a producer on there, Jessica Dwyer. She's a writer as well, a entertainment journalist and a horror journalist, and she's a friend of mine. When I was the executive editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine, I met her when we were on the set of The Conjuring 2, and I hired her to write for me, write some stuff, and she's got a great insight and great personality. And so I was taking a walk one day, and she said, "Hey, listen, there's this other movie that I'm working on. It's something that you definitely should talk to Robin Block about." And so, long story short, I talked to Robin and I said, this sounds really cool. You've got an amazing trailer. You've got wonderful artwork. You've already attached some pretty cool names on here. What can I do? What can I offer you? And I came on as an advisor. But my background is I worked at Entertainment Tonight for 13 years, and then before I was with Famous Monsters. And I do a lot of sit-down interviews with filmmakers and stars and actors and tastemakers and so on and so forth. And that's really my forte. That's something that I really love. And I offered up my services to do that. And he offered me this incredible silver platter opportunity.
You just mentioned before that there were some things already in place, some names. You have the idea, of course. You come in there with a passion for the genre and a background as an interviewer as well. I'm curious though, when it comes to the concept of the film, not only delving into the themes of that era, but what's really cool about In Search of Darkness is that it's almost kind of like an encyclopedic kind of documentary in that you delve into specific films per year through that decade. How far into it was that concept ready to go, or was that something that you brought to the table?
Robin wanted to do a survey of the entire decade going year by year. And I thought that was a real fun idea, but I also felt like there are pitfalls to that. Because you can't cover everything. There was just an incredible output that decade. And the pitfalls are, I think it could potentially get repetitive. I think you also, when you're focusing on movie by movie by movie, you might not be able to tackle the larger themes in context. So what I did was I inserted in between each year a look at various aspects of that decade, whether it was the filmmaking aspects of it or the socio-political, the VHS and the cable revolution, 3D, heroes, villains, the final girl, fandom. I felt all those things, it would be remiss if we didn't touch on that. And I sort of thought that the only way we could do that is intersperse in between each timeline year. And of course, that's where we got into our initial conundrum of this is getting longer and longer and longer, and it's still only scratching the surface. And we decided to pretty much put in anywhere between 5 and 10 films per year, and then in between we would put those sort of subsection chapters that, to me, I think really are crucial to provide a proper historical overview of that decade and its place, and where the horror was a response to what was going on to that decade, and an influence to the filmmakers themselves wanting to one-up each other or compete or emulate each other. The inspiration was clearly there, and building everything from building franchises and horror icons to stretching the limits of the genre, because the slasher genre could take things only so far, so you had to get more imaginative and tackle more subgenres, whether it's body horror or the supernatural. It was just a blank canvas for the creativity and the opportunity for filmmakers to go with straight to video. They could do anything they wanted with a new distribution avenue. So what did I bring to the table? I think I brought a complementary enthusiasm for this genre, having grown up in that time. I mean, I was a video store clerk. I watched these movies first run in the movie theaters and in the basements of my friend's house, and I never had cable TV, but my friends did, so I'd selectively say, oh, Friday the 13th is playing at 2 a.m, on Saturday night. I think I'm going to go to my friend Sergio's house because he's got cable in his room, and guess what? We're going to wake up at 2 a.m. to watch that. And I was way too young, and it made an amazing impression on me. But I think very much informs what I was able to do with this, because on top of tackling a huge, broad range of material with the people who were there and the people commenting not only on their own films, but the films that they love too, I got to really insert a lot of my nostalgic insight, having been there, to speak to the people who were there themselves and appreciated all of it that was going on.
For someone like myself who grew up in the 80s, watched a lot of the movies that was mentioned in the documentary, it was really fun to pick up new recommendations. There are films in there that I hadn't seen before, and I was actually jotting down a list of movies I want to watch during watching your movie. I'm curious though, when it comes to choosing which films you were going to highlight, how does that come across? Is it decision by committee? Is there films that weren't on the table that you said, wait a minute, we need to talk about this movie as well? How did that all kind of work out?
I would say yes. All of the above. It wasn't really a film cut by committee. I would say that it was kind of an organic process. Part of it had to do with the talent that we got. And what they had been in. And I think that helped make sure, that helped ensure certain films like, say, Stepfather 2 with Caroline Williams would not be forgotten. Because like the Stepfather franchise, we didn't have time to do 1 and 2, but I could do 2 in an all-encompassing, hey, remember how cool Stepfather was? And here was my, what I did in Stepfather 2. I think I had a good read on the horror community and the types of things that they were really enthusiastic about, and the types of the less popular films that people would champion. And I would talk to. We have what was really cool about our company it's called Creator VC that Robin created. He assembled an advisor group, and that's what I was on originally. Where you sort of bounce around ideas and you say, let's put together a list of the most popular films and the most obscure films and the most eccentric films and the most beloved films and the forgotten films and the most popular ones. And it's really a process of being able to sort of distill what was available, who had seen these things, who could talk about them, who was in it, and ultimately how much can we fit and how much material is robust enough to include when we're already going past 4 hours and steaming past 5. I mean, I delivered a 5-hour cut, and pretty much the reason why we had to scale back was manufacturing purposes. We had to weigh whether or not we'd do a 1-disc or a 2-disc set. What did the backers want? Will people want to sit through a movie this long? Can on a dual layer disc, a Blu-ray, can you fit a 5-hour movie? Not, you actually can't. So lots of specifics came into play. But in terms of the actual movie choices, fundamentally, I wanted the really popular ones, and I wanted the really eccentric ones, and I wanted the ones in between. And I wanted the ones that were big theatrical hits. I wanted box office misses, and I wanted straight-to-video favorites. And lastly, I'll say about it is that I said this film only scratches the surface. There's so much to be covered, and you can't do it all. So I made a very difficult but conscious choice to focus only on American films. And I also made sure that within each year, even though we're only going to do a small survey of films that we focus on, at the very least, I could put a wall of posters of every film that came out that year to at least indicate to the viewer that we know that these movies are out there and that they exist. And perhaps one day we'll be able to zoom in on those.
What I really love about the documentary is that it kind of delves in all facets of the genre and of that decade. And I think one of my favorite parts of 80s horror movies is the creature and makeup effects. And throughout the film, we hear the names Tom Savini, Rob Bottin, Rick Baker, Stan Winston. This was a genre that was innovative for its creation of imaginary filmmaking. It brought the imaginary to life. And I think when looking back at the work that these names did and other names as well throughout the genre, is there any doubt, David, that this film genre, this red-headed stepchild of a film genre, really did change the movie industry as a whole?
I think it really did, at least from the special makeup effects standpoint. American Werewolf in London was the first film. Rick Baker was the first special makeup effects artist to win an Oscar that was specially created for that category, and American Werewolf was nominated and won. I think that speaks volumes of the attention and respect that it got in the 80s. It was also a time where Tom Savini's background, for example, is in Vietnam. He saw some really, really horrifying stuff. And that very much educated and informed and created the template in his brain for extremely realistic makeup effects. You look at Maniac and you look at these scalpings. Maniac is a hard film to watch because it's so realistic. But I think a lot of these folks, whether it was Rob Bottin doing very specifically like The Howling and The Thing, people would look at these things alongside Rick Baker and Tom Savini and everyone else. They would see the bar was raising with every single film. It was getting higher and higher and higher, and everyone said, "Look what they did! I want to do that too." So it almost culminates in, you look at like Reanimator and From Beyond as Stuart Gordon's films as these almost pinnacles of plastic and latex and blood and Caro syrup. It's exciting to see. But it's also interesting to see, like, you look at Sam Raimi's films. It can easily go over the top, but in the right context, it's hilarious. It's not over the top gross. It's over the top fun. depending on who you are watching it. And so I think people use these advances in the practical effects technology really to expand their storytelling, and there are no limits on the creativity of what you can put on screen.
I grew up in... sorry, go ahead.
I'll just addend one more thing, and that's people from other genres. While they might not be emulating, they were looking at this and they were looking at what was possible.
Yep.
And it very much seeped into every genre beyond the horror genre because of what they established in the 80s.
I'd argue that a lot of the things that are happening now in the superhero movie genre, for example, definitely had influence from what was happening, especially from a special effects and creature effects impact from horror films.
Very much so. I think the what everyone talks about today is it's even overplayed, and we've seen a progression of it. But it's how CGI changed things. It's very ironic that at the time that practical makeup effects was at its zenith, it was ultimately kicked to the curb, so to speak, with the invention of CGI. And the more CGI became prevalent, the cheaper it got, the more easy it was for filmmakers to rely on that as a crutch. And especially with the amount of money that would be put in CGI that was not especially expensive, you could see the results were not satisfying. But that's also what upwards of 2 decades or 3 decades of audiences got. And I think ultimately people got the pendulum has swung back, or is in the process of swinging back, where filmmakers are keen on using practical effects, but using CGI to sweeten it ever so slightly. I've had the privilege of speaking to John Carpenter in this film. I've spoken to Ridley Scott, Mike Dougherty. They're all people who very much singled out when I say CGI, terrible, what do you think? And they say, well, no, CGI, when used right, is just as effective a tool as practical effects. But it has to be used right, and it has to be used properly in the context. And CGI is not the villain in this story. If CGI is used right, you don't even notice it. You go to, say, J.J. Abrams going back with, The Force Awakens and using puppets and practical effects instead of just CGI creatures. There was a tremendous appreciation and fan service happening there, because there's a whole generation that is watching these movies and reminiscing about the movies that they loved in the 80s, and practical effects is really what rears its head each and every time. So I think it's nice that filmmakers are recognizing that this is what audiences want, and that's tangible things. But I'll finish by saying, with superhero films, Avengers, sci-fi films currently, we're at a stage now where sometimes they're so polished, even if it is a practical effect or an actual stunt, it's hard to tell the difference now. And because we're so trained to think that everything is CGI now, the appreciation is challenged, because you can't quite tell whether or not you're looking at something that's real on screen or that really happened on screen or not. So, I think we still have a ways to go.
I grew up in the VHS era. A lot of people did as well. And I think a lot like that. A lot of people had an older brother or an older sister would bring home all different sorts of videos, and a lot of those were horror movies. And I remember when I got older, I could get my own video card. I used to go down to the local Video Easy or Blockbuster and get my own stuff. And the horror section was the first place that I went to. And I think it was really interesting that at that time, filmmakers who, previous to that, the only place you can show your films was in cinemas. Now they have a totally different distribution model. They also have a totally different audience that sees their films in a different way. All of a sudden, your film, which used to be on this really big screen, is on a really small one. And I'm curious, in your research and talking to directors, did that change whatsoever the way that they made movies? Transitioning from films that not only were seen in big and small screens, the way they would approach, cinematography, makeup, we were just talking about that as well. Did that change things whatsoever in regards to filmmaking style when catering to a specific sort of medium? Or sorry, sort of transition of technology, sorry?
I would say that it's been a challenge for filmmakers. Some have embraced sort of the digital realm, others have not, or they've fought it a little more. You can see the seams more easily when it's HD, when it's 4K, when it's 6K, when it's 20K. It's just going to keep on. Soon we're just going to be interacting with holograms. It's going to happen sooner than you think, but ultimately, the filmmakers creating the content is king. The story is the most important thing, and that's really what they rely on. And I don't think they really change things to reflect the format. If anything, I think they've had to rally more to get people to watch things on the big screen, because not only is it a larger image, but it's a communal experience. And a lot of these films, it's important, especially, I would argue, comedy most importantly. It's important to have a communal experience where everyone is laughing together at the screen. It's a funnier film when everyone's laughing. When you're at home, even if it's a hysterical film, it's just not as funny. It's a different experience. So I would just say, like I said, the sort of this HD element is probably the thing that you need to filmmakers are focusing on even more, because you used to be able to get away with certain things because you couldn't pause it, you couldn't zoom in on it. It would go by fast enough where with sleight of hand they can create an illusion. But now it's a different animal when people are viewing and creating memes and getting to see things over and over and over. But ultimately, whether it's a streaming content, whether it's on your big screen TV at home or you're watching on your phone, it comes down to storytelling is the most important thing, and everyone I've spoken to concurs with that.
Final question. Considering the setting of these films, we're talking about the 80s, especially in the time of American politics, you had Ronald Reagan being president. You also had this interesting thing as well where when it came to censorship and ratings, so I'm a big heavy metal fan. And I kind of see heavy metal as kind of like the equivalent of the music genre rise to what the horror movie is. It's kind of like this genre of music that kind of can be mainstream most of the time, but most of the time was kind of like an underground thing, kind of like what horror movies are. And at that time, you had the PMRC, who was really trying to censor heavy metal musicians in particular. And these days, if I find that censorship doesn't so much come anymore, or not to the largest extent that these government bodies did, but censorship seems to come from the audience, especially if you look at social media. You're going through a certain kind of cancer culture kind of thing now. Films like, say, The Joker that are coming out, there are even film critics saying that this film should not be made. The word dangerous, etc. is being lobbied about, and I can't help but think of back in the 80s that a lot of films that came out were also hit with that sort of thing. What do you think about this evolution of censorship coming from in one era more of a government-driven thing, but these days it's coming from the people themselves and the gatekeepers of that, the entertainment journalists and the film critics, some of them also kind of joining in on the mob and saying that there should be some films that should or should not be seen?
Well, it's a very complicated scenario. You look at contemporary times, you look at The Joker. I think that film could easily have existed 20, 30 years ago, and the reaction would have been very different. But we live very much in a gun culture now, and we live in a very trigger-happy response culture as well. And so while I don't believe in censorship in any way, shape, or form, I think there are certain ways that you can position a film or release a film or talk about a film that needs to be responsible. That needs to be there needs to be caretakers of these things, so the people who see them for what they are, as reflective entertainment and not an instructional tool. And I think that's why people are afraid, and you can't deny that a movie like The Joker reflects a very troubling time that we're living in right now. So I think if a government isn't going to step in and censor, which I don't believe it should, I do believe that the village that we live in, the online village, the global community village, has to take responsibility not to censor the movies like The Joker, but to put them on be careful not to put them on a glorified platform. They need to be. You really need to point out why that this is a very critical take, but not necessarily an irresponsible one. Back in the 80s, it was a different story. There was sort of a more of a response at the Reaganomics element of that was the trickle down economics, all the things that I could throw Reagan buzzwords your way all day long, but ultimately it came down to there was sort of a snapback from the freedom that was found in the 60s and the 70s. And, Alex Winter says, I think he says it best in our film, it's like the grown-ups wanted to take the wheel back and control things. While, the 80s was really a decade of excess, it also became a symbol of upper crust corporate greed, and Wall Street greed is good was reflected not as a negative thing, but as a positive thing for a me generation that was taking over. John Carpenter responded to that with They Live because he was sickened by what he was seeing. But I think also there was a whole underground movement with this whole element of the home video revolution, is that filmmakers could still say anything that they wanted and tell original stories, whether you were David Cronenberg or, with Videodrome, or Frank Henenlotter with Basket Case. You could still say anything you wanted, and you could be as gross as you wanted. But if you wanted theatrical distribution, you had to be careful, because the MPAA would give you an X not for sex, but for violence. And, Mark Shostrom and Greg Nicotero, the two effects guys talking about that specifically, they would ultimately have to curtail the filmmakers who wanted to be as creative as possible. They'd say, listen, you got to take different avenues if you want to recoup your investment. Blood's got to be black or green or blue, because if it's red, it's going to get an X, or if it's not cartoonish, it's going to get an X. So there were ratings that you still had to contend with during that time. But last I'll say about it is that there was still the whole grindhouse movement going on in the 70s and the early 80s, where a lot of these films, if they didn't hit your local multiplex, that the family could see, Basket Case, it would be playing in Times Square. It would be playing at your local grindhouse, and you could still see these midnight movies of, Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead and Romero films, and it was out there if you wanted to get to it, and there really was no censorship, and I don't believe there ever should be. It just needs to be responsible responses to the material that does come out.
So for everyone listening, In Search of Darkness, available for pre-order now. You can go to 80shorrordoc.com. So there's different kind of different type of options of packaging you can get. There's different type of things you can get. There's posters, there's movie pins. You can get a digital download. So many cool things that come with this documentary, including the documentary itself. I highly recommend this film. David, I'm writing down in my review now that this is a movie that not only horror fans will really enjoy, but horror novices as well, because I think it's a really kind of great encyclopedic kind of introduction to this era in particular of horror filmmaking. And what's really cool about your documentary too is that you bring up films of past as well. There's mentions to films like Dawn of the Dead with Tom Savini's role in there. Exorcist, talk about Dick Smith stuff in there as well. So it's just a great documentary, and I think you and I can talk all day about this. Unfortunately, we don't have that time, but I do want to say thank you for the time you have given me today, and congratulations to you with the documentary.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ultimately, at the end of the day, when you see this film, it's meant to be a big nostalgia trip, and hopefully it inspires you to revisit your favorites and discover brand new ones, and share your love of horror, and let people know that horror doesn't necessarily have to be horrific. It could be definitely entertaining for the uninitiated.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, David, for your time. Hopefully you and I can talk again in the future in regards to any future projects you have.
Thank you so much for having me on, Matt. I do appreciate it.